decided to address. And this is something to have the great contribution that Thomas Piketty has made globally in terms of drawing world's attention on this very question of inequality. With rising income levels across global south, we are seeing multiple challenges coming up in terms of disruption in the growth, the idea of bringing in people within that ambit. For last 10 years or so, India has been discussing issues related to inclusive approaches, the dimensions of our efforts in terms of taking economic growth to those areas, those pockets, through different structures and approaches where contributions can be made. And this is something that Thomas has been trying to bring to the larger global attention. The grand dynamics that drive accumulation of wealth, the grand dynamics that drive distribution of wealth is something which is not just confined to social justice alone, but is also in terms of the wider moral imperatives that it brings on stage. The idea of lifestyle for sustainable development, life that India took forward in the G20 presidency, was not just an issue of addressing climate justice, but it was also part of bringing in moral fabric back in our considerations, back on stage for wider discussions that we require. So social justice and the ideas related to inequality, long-term inequality, short-term inequality, inequalities which are sort of bringing in prospects and hopes for economic growth. Are we doing enough to ensure that? And today we have lined up a panel which is going to bring forward this extremely important issue of how dimensions are relevant. As you are aware, RIS is a research institution that has been focusing on trade as our major focus. And our idea is to bring forward issues where trade is driving inequality. And this is something that for last several decades, Global South has been prescribed to open up the borders, to open up and bring in trade liberalization, open up. And we thought that sometimes we felt there is a trade-off between efficiency and our idea of optimum gains from trade. And this is where the larger issues for the Global South are. The efforts in terms of addressing trade through inequality is something that Global South has been trying to address. Our idea is also getting sort of implemented through regional disparities that are important. The idea of what we see in Vietnam, what we see in Cambodia in terms of economic growth and high income that they are achieving through opening up of trade, what we see in Chile, are some things that we are realizing are important. What we saw in Thailand with the structural instability, and particularly in some Latin American countries where Dutch disease became prominent, inequalities through trade have actually worsened. And that's where the questions are extremely important for us. There are also questions related to gender inequality that trade at times bring in. And how do we address that? We are seeing that specific sectors, right, like ready-made garments in our own neighborhood in Sri Lanka, we are realizing how it has benefited several women groups across to strengthen that. We are also seeing how in Vietnam, grand efforts for policy coordination for countries that are entering into FTA, it has helped. In Rwanda, we find coffee and handicrafts. In Mexico, assembly of industrial units. Even in India, RIS did a study on software sector where we found how inequality and inclusion have been adequately addressed in the digital space by several programs. So this is something that is a long sort of story where inequality, economic development, and efforts for inclusion are extremely important to address. As I said, through two major books, Thomas Piketty has drawn world's attention, how wealth is created, how we bring in ideological wars which are there in terms of creating inequality. So Thomas would be presenting that. We have also, we are very fortunate to have Shamika Ravi with us. whose recent papers on how demand in rural areas have triggered in greater inclusion, I think are extremely important numbers that she has today to share with us. We are also very fortunate to have Chief Economic Advisor who could find time from his very busy schedule when the chief secretaries are meeting here in Delhi. It was not easy to pull him out of that meeting. So I'm glad and delighted that he could make it. My own colleague on the board of the Reserve Bank and India's most eminent person who has been guiding statistics and macroeconomics at IIM Ahmedabad for many years, and now as independent commentator, Professor Dholakia requires no introduction to this. And as I said in the beginning, we are extremely delighted to have this partnership with Delhi School of Economics and somebody who has tried to bring in law and economics together. Professor Ram Singh, with his leadership at D School, has got this major dynamics together in terms of addressing macroeconomic policies and initiatives across several academic institutions. I'm extremely thankful to all of you for joining us today in such large numbers. Without further ado, let me invite Thomas Piketty for his address. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, and thanks a lot for inviting me. So first I should apologize that my English is going to sound a lot like French, but I hope you will be able to understand me. And so I'm going to show you a number of results today. Well, if we can project the slides on inequality and inclusive growth. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to show you today, a number of results that we have put together on the structure of inequality throughout the world, and I will try to emphasize, the implication from an Indian perspective and more generally from a global South perspective. So first of all, let me say that, this World Inequality Database is the output of a very collective research program. More than 200 researchers, including many researchers in India, have been involved, and you will get a lot more information by going online on this website. All the data is publicly available, and I'm going to show you some illustration from this. I will also show a few results from the World Inequality Report 2022, and we will publish another one in 2026, which is a sort of synthesis of the data that is on this website. I will also show you a few results from my latest book, A Brief History of Equality, which has the advantage of being a lot shorter than the previous two. Capital in the 21st Century and Capital and Ideology are each 1,000 page long. So, if you don't have time, which I fully respect and understand, this one is like 200 page long, can be read in a weekend. And, I think it's also, in a way, a lot clearer and a lot more optimistic also, because what I try to stress in this book is that in the long run, there is a movement, an historical movement toward more equality, which has been very successful and which has been very successful to bring not only more equality, but also more prosperity in the long run. And I think, this optimistic message, is important for all of us, including for India. And I will also show, some results from a recent research on inequality in India, which we have published at the World Inequality Lab earlier this year in 2024, which you will find online very easily. So let me start with sort of the global picture, and we'll talk more about the position of India into this global picture. The first map of the world I would like to show you is a map with a very simple indicator, which is the share of national income going to the top 10%. So by construction, we're talking about 10% of the population. So if we had complete equality, they should have 10% of income. And if we had complete inequality, they should have 100% of income. So of course, the real world is always in between 10 and 100, but it actually varies a lot. That's the first message. So it doesn't go from 10 to 100, but it goes from 20-25% in Nordic Europe to almost 70% in South Africa, 65-70% in South Africa. So you can see, the magnitude of the disparity is enormous. Now, where is India on the map? India, from the data we have, which is imperfect, is around 55% or a bit more for the top 10%. So, it's less inequality than South Africa, but it's a lot more than countries in Europe, North America, Japan. Rich countries in general are a bit more equal, well, sometimes a lot more equal. India is more comparable to Brazil or Mexico, so quite very unequal countries, less than South Africa, but more to like Latin America. If we take this simple indicator. Now, an even better indicator, which in a way is more important for all of us, is the share going to the bottom 50% of society. So again, let's try to remember the orders of magnitude. We can have little dispute about the exact decimal numbers, but I think the orders of magnitude cannot really be disputed all that much. And these orders of magnitude are important. So we're talking of 50% of the population. So if we had complete equality, they should have 50% of total income. If we had complete inequality, they should have 0%. The real world, of course, again, is always between the two. It goes from the lowest level will be about 5% in South Africa to as much as 25-30% in Nordic Europe. So let's see concretely what it means. If you are 50% of the population, you are the bottom 50%, you receive say 25% or 30% of total income, it means that your average income is about half, 50-60% of the average income of the country in which you live, which will be the case in Nordic Europe. So, of course, you are poorer than average. After all, you are the bottom 50%, but you are not hugely poorer than average. Now, if you have only 5% of total income, like in South Africa, as the bottom 50%, it means your average income is only 10% of the average income of your country. This is, by the way, I should say, this is after all cash transfer. This doesn't take into account in-kind transfer. We also have the data after in-kind transfer, which improves the situation a little bit, but this extreme level of inequality will still be almost as large. So in the case of, again, to continue with the example of South Africa, when you have 5% of total income as the bottom 50%, your average income is only 10% of the average income of your country. So it means there's really a huge gap between you and the rest of the country, and this, in terms of absolute poverty, this has enormous consequences which we all care about. And here we are not talking about the extremely poor. We are looking at the bottom 50% of the country and their average income. So the bottom line, the main conclusion here I would like to remember is that the distribution matters a lot. And people who say, we should only look at growth and not care about the distribution, you can see here that what this data shows is that for the same average income, so for the same GDP per capita, the fact that the poor, that the bottom 50% is going to get 5% of total income or 25-30% of total income is going to mean that the average income of the bottom 50% is going to vary, by a factor of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 for a given GDP per capita. So if you forget about this, in terms of absolute poverty, so again, where is India on the map? India, from our estimates, and the bottom 50% has about 10-15% of average income, of total income, and their share has been going down, over the past 20-30 years. So again, it's not South Africa, but it's still, very far from the most equal countries in the world. Now, the last thing I would like to say about this world map, which is quite important, is that it's not always been like that. So these things change over time. They are not frozen. This is, you don't have sort of deep cultural reason which makes some countries more equal forever or some more unequal forever. These things change, and policies matter, and political change and institutions matter. So if you take, the rich countries today in Europe, they look quite equal as compared to India. But if you, what we've done in the World Inequality Database and what I've done in my research work is to construct historical series, going back to the 19th century or even to the French Revolution in the case of France. And the bottom line is that 1 century ago, Europe was a lot more equal. It was not South Africa, but it was actually close to Latin America or India today. In terms of the top 10% income share was like 50, 55%, and the bottom 50% income share was like 10 to 15%, so pretty close. And these countries, in Europe and also in the US and Japan, to a lesser extent, have become more equal over the course of the 20th century. Was it bad for growth? Well, in fact, I will argue, and I argue in my work, that this is what has made growth even faster, especially after World War II, because this reduction of inequality, came with more inclusive investment in education and health. And, I think that's a very important lesson. And it's also true when you compare India to China. The idea that a country like India should just wait to become richer before worrying about inequality, I think doesn't quite fit with the historical and comparative evidence that we have, which suggests that, in fact, reducing inequality is also a way to get more growth and to become richer by having more inclusive system. And from this point of view, India really looks very unequal. So I will show you a little more data on the case of India in a minute. Let me also say, looking at these graphs, that the way rich countries have become rich historically is not just, of course, by becoming more equal. They have become rich by exploiting natural resources of the world and sometimes human resources of the world in an extremely brutal manner, as we all know. And this has been absolutely central in the process through which the West became rich. And we see today the consequences in terms of climate change and the responsibility of Western countries with respect to climate change, in particular with respect to a country like India, is absolutely enormous. And I will come back to that in a minute. But we should also, when we look at the comparative experience of different parts of the world, we should not forget that over the course of the 20th century, an additional reason which allowed rich countries to become rich is actually by reducing inequality. After big political trauma of World War I, World War II, this did not happen easily. But in the end, this was very positive also for their economic growth and economic development. And it's a bit difficult with all the problems that India has to solve, maybe to look at this evidence. But I think we need to all try to use this historical legacy of different countries also to learn about what's the socially optimal level of inequality in a country. Now, in our work in the World Inequality Report, we look not only at income inequality but also wealth inequality. Here, the bottom line, and I'm just showing you this graph, is that the wealth inequality is always a lot bigger than income inequality. And to be honest, no region in the world is really in a position to give lessons about this. I think, there's a bit less inequality in Europe than in South Asia, but, it's in both cases, if you compare India with Europe, the bottom 50% basically gets very little wealth, 5% of total wealth or less. The top 10% gets 65% of more, which I think, in the long run is really an issue, because it means that, bottom 50% children are going to inherit almost nothing, whereas, top 10%, top 1% children inherit a lot more, which I think is a waste for the economy, because, there are lots of bottom 50% children who would have lots of great ideas to create firm and develop their project, and, access to credit is difficult. Of course, we should improve access to credit, but, with such a concentration of inheritance, I don't think this is useful. There's been a little bit of equalization in the long run, to be clear. So you see this middle 40% group, the green bar here, used to be 1 century ago, it used to be almost as poor as the bottom 50%. And so, they have gained their share today. What I call the patrimonial middle class or the wealth middle class is actually larger today, or in Europe or in India, than what it was 100 years ago. And I think it has been good. I mean, the people in the top 10%, and especially the top 1%, they have lost over the course of a century. And if you had told that to them 1 century ago, they would have said, no, the sky is going to fall, the economy is going disappear, is going to break down if you reduce our wealth share. But in fact, their wealth share was reduced, the wealth share of the middle class increased, and in the long run, the sky did not fall. This means that more people in the middle class were able to buy homes, construct housing, start up small businesses. And I think in the very long run, having more people in the bottom 50%, and particular bottom 50% children to have access to wealth is actually very positive. We also look at gender inequality in the World Inequality Database. Let me show you just one simple indicator, which is the share of women in total labor income, including wage income and self-employment income, to the extent we can measure it using household survey. The bottom line is that the share of women is particularly small in India and South Asia, but to be honest, it is small everywhere, including in Western countries where it has increased a little bit, but it's much below 50% everywhere, in spite of the fact that women supply more than 50% of total labor time, if we include domestic labor, in absolutely every country, every region in the world by far. So clearly, there's again, I think there's no country that is really in a position to give lessons about that. The last sort of global piece of evidence on inequality I would like to show you, and then I will conclude with a few slides specifically on India, is the per capita carbon emission. So, okay, we all know that per capita emissions have been very low in India historically, as compared to the global north, and countries in the north have an enormous historical responsibility, of course, in global warming. And I think that's very important because we've had this discussion, and you were referring to them in the introduction in the G20, for instance, for a global wealth tax. And I think we need not only Brazil but also India, to be very active in this discussion. And I think, I don't have much hope for the US or even Europe to really share the wealth with the South if it doesn't come with a lot of pressure coming from the global South. And if we want to have some funding mechanism for climate reparation and for a well-financed, adaptation fund or mitigation fund for climate change, I think we need some tax revenue to pay for this, because if it's always rich countries deciding to make a check each year, it's just never going to work. So there needs to be some actually tax instruments that pays for this. And, the global billionaire tax, which, when I wrote Capital in the 21st Century 10 years ago, I was proposing this global wealth tax, and, everybody was laughing, saying, oh, this is completely naive, etc. 10 years ago at the G20 meeting, this is being discussed. This doesn't come at the initiative of Western countries, of Europe or Europe. This comes at the initiative of Brazil. And that's very important, because I think a lot of this initiative in the future will have to come from the global South. And this is where India has a tremendously important role to play. And, of course, I would have preferred, India to be much more supportive and active of this initiative, because I think we need these climate reparations, to be tied to this kind of global billionaire tax. Now, what I also want to stress is that it's important to be aware of the very large inequality in carbon emission within country. So, of course, the global responsibility of rich countries with respect to poor countries is undisputable. But, within rich country and within poor countries, you have a lot of disparities in responsibilities as well. So if you look at Europe, today, if you look at the bottom 50% of Europe, their average emission is about 5.1. This is including, all the carbon content of import, which sometimes we tend to forget, in rich countries, but that's very important. It will be lower if we did not include it. It is 5.1. This is too large. We are supposed to reduce this to 3 or 2 or 1, but this is not completely out of line with the targets. The problem is that the top 10% emitters in Europe have 29, the top 10% in North America have 73, and if you look at top 1% or at billionaires taking their private jet, you will be several hundred or more in carbon emissions. So if you don't tackle the issue of inequality at the same time as you want to reduce carbon emissions, that's not going to work. If you look at South Asia, and India is South and Southeast Asia, India is a big part of it, and I think the numbers for India alone will be even a bit lower than the average for South and Southeast Asia. You can see that the averages are very small for the bottom 50%, the middle 40%. But it's interesting to see that the top 10% in India have higher emission than the bottom 50% in Europe. Now, this doesn't mean that the top 10% in India should pay a transfer to the bottom 50% in Europe, because, you know, the historical emissions of all of Europeans is much bigger than the historical responsibility of all of India. But this also means that, you know, you cannot just think in terms of, between country relation and nation against nation, because, you know, within each country, within each nation, you have so much inequality. And this is why, you know, basically a billionaire tax or progressive tax on the wealthy from Europe, from US, from India, from China is a better tool to address the reality. Let me conclude with a few slides on India, just to stress that, you know, from the data that we have, which is very imperfect, and I would love to have, you know, the government of India publishing more information on income and wealth, to have more registration of wealth through inheritance taxation, through property or wealth taxation. And in a way, you know, it's sad that we have to look at magazines to know at wealth rankings. You know, I would much prefer to have publicly available statistics. Also for the income tax, you know, I would prefer to have much more data. Anyway, we do with what we have. We combine all sources from household survey, national accounts, income tax data, wealth rankings, you know, all the data sources we can. This is what we come up with, and this is quite a spectacular increase in inequality. If you look at the big map with, you know, the top 10%, the bottom 50%, you know, you get the numbers I mentioned with the world map before, which is that the top 10% in India today has between 55–60% of total income. The bottom 50% has only 15%. And you can see the rise of inequality since the 1990s. Now, I understand, you know, some people say in India, well, maybe inequality was too low to begin with, you know, before 1991 and in the Nehru-Gandhi period. So in fact, increasing inequality is justified, and, you know, maybe we should go even higher. I understand this argument, except that if you compare with other countries, so say China, okay, there was also an increase in inequality in China, but even after the increase, the post-reform increase in inequality in China, today there's less inequality in China than there was in India before the reform. So at some point, you know, this argument cannot justify any level of inequality. And I think looking at the numbers, trying to make comparison between countries is not the final word on anything, but it's part of the discussion, and we need to take this seriously. And another way to look at this is to compare explicitly. So here, you know, we have the top 10%, top 1% income share for income. You can see India is sort of comparable to Brazil, or even more, a bit more unequal to Brazil, less unequal than South Africa, but certainly very far away from China, Europe, or even the US, which is more unequal than Europe, but less unequal than China in terms of shares. So in our work with Nitin Bharti, Anmol Somanchi, and Lucas Chancel, we have made some proposal, you know, in order to ask top wealth holders in India and top billionaires in particular to contribute more to tax revenue in India. So, you know, these are, you know, here we have a baseline, a moderate, ambitious proposal. You know, I think some people, you know, will think that even the moderate or the baseline is far too much. You know, I think in terms of tax rate on wealth, this is very, you know, this is quite moderate. The bottom line is that given the level of wealth concentration in India today, this will bring very substantial revenue. Maybe another way to put it is this, which is to compare, you know, this extra tax revenue that will come from these tax changes to the level of public expenditure. And you can see that, you know, in the moderate proposal, you will get tax revenue, which will be 92% of total health education spending in India today. So, you know, even if you choose a tax that is twice as small as this, you know, this is still substantial. And in the longer run, you know, of course, it's impossible to solve all the problem of India or any country just by taxing billionaires. You know, I know the numbers, I work with the numbers, so I know that, you know, you need in the long run, for instance, you know, the income tax in India today is about 10% of the population. You know, in the long run, it should be probably 20, 30 more, as other countries have done. But it's very difficult to ask more effort to the middle class or upper middle class of India if you have people at the very top, whose income, from the information we have today, the income tax paid by very top billionaires in India is a ridiculously small fraction of their wealth. And so if you don't start to restore some kind of tax fairness at the very bottom, I think it's going to be very difficult to mobilize resources from the rest of the population to invest more in health, education, public infrastructure in India. So let me stop there. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward for the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks a lot for a very comprehensive address. Let me now bring in the panel members. First, we would begin with Dr. Shamika Ravi, Member, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Dr. Ravi.
Namaskar. Thank you to Delhi School and RIS for this wonderful opportunity. Let me first start out by saying, inequality is a very important concern. It's a very important concern, particularly for democracies, because there is fundamentally something unjust about high levels of inequality. So it's quite appealing to understand why this kind of an effort must go in. I really applaud Professor Piketty's work on this issue, particularly for the OECD countries, the richer nations. But I'll tell you why it's a bit of an overreach when we try to superimpose on nations such as India. And I'll refer a little bit to China as well. But remember that I'm a microeconomist. For me, the devil is always in the details, and I've been warned since day one that be extremely wary of cross-country regressions. And I'll tell you why. Today, I'm going to give you a talk on exactly why that philosophy still holds pretty much. First, let's talk about the theoretical underpinnings a little bit. That lower inequality is good for growth. It sounds wonderful, but neither the theoretical nor the empirical, the causal link is not entirely clear. That's number one. Number two, as someone who's advising the government, as looking closely at the Indian economy from various facets of the real sectors, my key concern is how do I raise labor productivity? Because even within the narrow framework of what Professor Piketty has shown us, the difference in the returns to capital and growth for the nation, which drives further inequality, I do see the intrinsic appeal of taxing the rich. There must be tax. But how does it translate directly into rising productivity is not clear to me. And for me, that is a big problem. Because stagnant wages in many parts of the emerging markets, but I'd say even in the OECD nations, stagnant wages are also a reflection of stagnant productivity of labor. Now, keep those things in mind. I will talk a little bit about data quality towards the end, and I'll refer you to some more interesting and I think very compelling evidence on the quality of data that emerges from countries such as China. So let's start with what is it that I'm currently completely consumed and excited by? The household consumption expenditure survey that has come out in India. Because it's 10 years and now we finally have very good details for seeing what is happening to consumption for the poorest segment of the society, because for me, that is a very key concern. If indeed you look at the consumption inequality, and I'll show you various metrics of it, the consumption inequality in India is falling very drastically. If you look at the Gini coefficient in terms of consumption, in the rural areas, it has fallen from 0.283 to 0.266. And in urban areas, it has fallen from 0.363 to 0.314. So all in all, these are really the broad Ginis, right? But of course, being a microeconomist, I have to tell you different components to the consumption, where now there is more and more evidence to suggest that the relative consumption patterns of the bottom quintile is actually rising much faster than it is for the top quintile. But the Gini for consumption has declined significantly for both rural and urban India over the last 10 years. If I just look at the monthly per capita consumption expenditure, and I compare the top 20% with the bottom 20%, that ratio used to be approximately 3.5 times 10 years back. That has fallen to 3.3. And in urban areas, it has fallen from 5.5 times to 4.4 times. These are not small changes. So these are big changes if you just look at monthly per capita consumption expenditure as a whole. Now I'll tell you a little bit about the details. Again, I warned you I'm a microeconomist. These are the things I obsess about. Let's look at different components of even food. Food expenditure overall has risen dramatically for the bottom 2 quintiles. But if you look at various components of it, 10 years back, 63% of Indians would report that they have eaten some form of fresh fruits. Today, it's above 90%. Of this, 44% of the poorest used to declare this 10 years back. Today, that number is 82%. So it's almost like a doubling of people who are reporting these kind of things. So while on an average, fruit consumption has risen 43%, for the bottom 20%, it has increased 86%. Now, this is spending. So one can say, well, there are all kinds of things involved in spending. Though these are households that are reporting spending something on fresh fruits. What about kilograms? And that's the beauty of some of this data. It's quite compelling. If you look at the actual quantity consumed, you are seeing that the average quantity has increased 42% for an average Indian, kilograms, from 1.9 to 2.7. But what about the bottom 20%? It has increased 87%. That's the kind of increase you're looking at in terms of actual quantity increase. If you look at, that was for urban, for rural, again, 30% average, 54% for the bottom 20%. What about milk and milk products? 16% on average, 34% for the bottom 20%. What about the quantity of milk? 10% overall, 45% increase in liters, actual per capita liters for the bottom 20%. Consume eggs, fish, and meat, 25% increase overall, 36% increase in terms of households that are reporting increase in the bottom 20%. And the quantities, 45% increase overall, 80% increase in terms of quantity of eggs, fish, and meat consumed at the bottom 20%. You are getting the drift, and this I could go on, by the way. I could go on for multiple. If you look at the bottom 20% ownership of assets, and I'm not looking at government programs which have targeted bottom, let's say, 2 quintiles. So I'm not talking about home ownership. I'm not talking about toilets. I'm not talking about any of the schemes. I'm talking about what's happening in the economy over and beyond government targeting. Asset ownership, and a major asset in households, particularly in the bottom 20%, is a vehicle. Vehicular ownership in India in the bottom 20% used to be 4% on average. This is your poorest 20%. Today, that number is in excess of 40%. Do you see the dramatic increase that is happening as far as consumption of various different kinds of things that go into the basket is concerned. Now I'll spend a minute on Professor Piketty's data. Of course, he's interested in global studies, but I'll be very clear, I'm interested in what's happening in India. And of course, the effort here is to improve things in India. This is Professor's data on the share of the bottom 50%. What has happened over the last 20 years is the share of the bottom 50% steadily fell all the way up to 2016-17. Do you see that? And then something happened because of which there was a reversal. The share of bottom 20%, bottom 50% went from 13.9, it went up to 15.5%. You know, when you look at cross-country studies, you gloss over these things. But for someone studying the Indian economy, this is a very major finding. We need scholarship to explain what could have contributed to this major reversal in the share of the bottom 50%. I can think of one, the major shocks that happened around that time, but we need much more rigorous empirical studies to show why this reversal happened. But reversals are possible. Reversals have happened in countries, and from a policy perspective, this is an important point to highlight. Just 1 minute on data quality. There's a fascinating study that came out in the Journal of Political Economy, one of the highest rated journals in economics. And it showed that autocracies overstate GDP by approximately 35%. Example, the Chinese GDP growth has been substantially and systematically exaggerated. In fact, if you adjust for it, for manipulation, in particular, these are their words, the gap between India and China is much smaller. That's as far as data, what is perceived as credible data and thrown into this big sausage-making machinery, which is what cross-country regressions and studies are. We have to look at these minutiae. We have to look at these data quality issues and see what are the ingredients going into these larger findings. If you look at the income tax data, in fact, the graph is from the JP article. It's fascinating. I suggest you go and read it. If you look at the income tax data, which is a large part of Professor Piketty's scholarship, every Indian in this room knows that when tax rates were exorbitantly high, 90% and above in the 70s and 80s, how many people really paid taxes? So reduction in tax rate and greater compliance, and you're seeing what is happening on a day-to-day basis. Little bit because he did refer to women. There is a most recent paper we have published on female labor force participation. You know, our job is to look at the data and see how things are empirically on the ground, away from these theoretical, larger underpinnings. And you know what India has witnessed in the last 7-8 years? A complete reversal of the decline which you saw in labor force participation of women. In fact, in the last 7-8 years, we have had a 69% increase in female labor force participation in rural areas and a 25% increase in urban areas. This is state after state after state. The only places where it seems to have declined a little bit is Goa and Lakshadweep. So there is something structurally major happening across the country. And of course, perhaps it's a culmination of all these efforts, and we need to study these schemes separately. Whether you're looking at the Antodaya Yojana, Mudra, you're looking at SAGs, after all, crores and crores of women have been brought into these, Drone Didi, etc., etc. But there is a culmination which is leading to more women actively participating in the labor force. And of course, the consumption data to me, and consumption inequality being a very important metric of quality of life, shows that inequality for consumption is declining and rather fast. So for all the Marxian economist friends in the room, I think India is a little further from a violent revolution than it was 10 years back. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks, Shamika, for triggering in more debate and more ideas on multiple fronts. Let me now invite Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India, Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran for his remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody, and my sincere thanks to Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, Professor Ram Singh for organizing this event and also for inviting me to share my thoughts with you. So, in financial world, certain words like innovation, predictability, and transparency are taken as indisputably positive sounding words, but nobody asked the question: transparency, predictability, innovations are for the benefit of whom? So certain words have a certain normative ring to them that one doesn't probe them further as to the public policy relevance of those words. This is true in the financial markets. And similarly, I don't think anybody can stand up in a podium and say, I don't think inequality matters as much as we think. That will be heresy. But that is the problem. That is, even before the discussion begins, any person advocating an alternative point of view is straightforwardly labeled as somebody who argues for status quo or for the wealthy or the rich, rather than wanting to have an honest discussion from a public policy perspective of what matters and what can be done by public policy. Whether it is in human lives or in public policy, there are problems and there are problems. Some problems have solutions where human intervention may make a difference. In some problems, sometimes human intervention can make it worse. Much as we may think the problem deserves to be addressed, we need to figure out whether your intervention will solve the problem or make it worse. And whether there is room for unintended consequences, because as we all know very well, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. So in other words, what matters? I would say for inequality, so many other things matter that a context-free presentation of the facts of inequality doesn't do justice to this topic. Geography matters. History matters. Most of the countries that we saw in the list of having a higher wealth or income inequality happen to be countries that were colonized. Climate matters. Many countries in the tropical world seem to have an inequality problem. Climate does matter. Size matters. It's much easier for smaller countries to achieve greater equality. The system of governance matters. Statistics matters, measurement matters. And well, emissions too matter. So many variables have implications for the distribution of income and wealth. So therefore, we need to be mindful of superficial analysis of where the problem is. In general, Price 360 has done an extensive survey even during COVID times. And if you look at their own numbers or the headline that they gave, because this is not my headlines, inside the image, they tend to have this, in this particular table, they have a very sensational headline. In 7 years, the number of rich in the country increased by 500%, while the number of poor decreased by only 58%. And you might immediately go away and you have a eye-catching headline, TRP or clickbait headlines. This is a wonderful number. And students of economics would know that you can make a line look steeper or flatter by varying the way in which you show the axis. So similarly, if you look at it, the population that were poor in 2015-16 was 11.5 crores. It has come down to 6.7 crores. There is a decline of 4.8 crores of the poor. And the rich population, it's a small size of the population that went from 2.4 to 10.1. Lower middle class declined, and middle class went from 57.9 to 64.8. Upper middle class increased 15 crores, 13.5 to 28.2. So there has been mobility across the income classes. That's what matters, which the headline very conveniently obscures, even though the statistics presented are there for us to interpret. And this slide also taken from them, that the gap between major religions also has come down from about 23 lakhs to just about 3 lakhs in terms of the gap in income on an annual basis. And the post-COVID recovery is more egalitarian because there is a 75% jump in the incomes of the poorest households post-COVID compared to the increase in incomes of the richer deciles or quintiles of the population, as you can see here in this slide. The bottom 20% income went up by 75%, and the richest 20% income went up by 9.6%. And if you look at the Gini coefficient, while it did increase between 2015-16 and 2021, the kind of income transfers and the free food programs and affordable housing programs, etc., have also brought down the Gini coefficient in India from 0.51 to 0.39. And the share in household disposable income of the bottom 10% actually went up, whereas the top 10% came down between 2021 and 22-23. In terms of the profile of the consuming class, you can see that the aspirers are 52%, which is the middle class, and whereas when it comes to income and expenditure, the middle class still continue to dominate in terms of the profiles of consumption for 2021, which happens to be a COVID year. So in other words, as I said, it is not the absolute levels that matter. It is the rate and the direction of change that matters. And post-COVID, the rate and the direction of change show that income for the lower two quintiles have done better than the incomes of the top quintile. And in an article that we wrote sometime in March, when the working paper by Professor Piketty and his co-authors came out, in terms of wealth inequality, their paper adjusted the wealth distribution at the top end using Forbes and Hurun's list data, which includes stock market wealth as a part of net worth. For venture capital funded firms, non-market implied valuations were also considered. The top percentile's rise in wealth is attributable to greater financialization of the Indian economy, a stock market boom, and VC valuations. And the Indian stock market boom, many of us now know that in the last 4 years, have spread to tier 2 and tier 3 cities, with even hitherto people who wouldn't have considered investing in stocks, even people with annual incomes of less than 1 million rupees, are now being able to partake in the equity market performance. And there has been a true democratization of stock market investing in the country. So we wrote, my co-author and I, if all that stands between India and a more equal distribution of wealth and income is a stock market correction, then we can ask if inequality is such a serious issue and whether it is an appropriate measure of the welfare of the people at the bottom of the country's income and wealth pyramid. Because the wealth inequality was largely attributable to the stock market increase, which in any case had become more democratized than before. The second and the third point which we made, as I think Shamika also made that point, if tax compliance has improved, then tax data will show higher income at higher ends, not because income inequality has increased, but because of better compliance. On the other hand, for the pre-1990 or the pre-2010 period, going all the way back to 1920, taking tax tables to prove that the top 1% earned less in previous years than today, assumes that tax compliance has remained uniform throughout this entire 100-year period, which is not a very realistic assumption. And Professor Ram Singh, more recent data, he uses unit level data to show tax compliance has increased sharply. In fact, between 2014 and 2022, the share of top 1% has increased only by 1 percentage point in terms of income. For the average aspirational Indian, the data showing that 248 million people escaped multidimensional poverty between 2014 and 2023 matters much more than the number of billions in the country. Reduction in poverty, not inequality, is the litmus test of inclusive growth. Third slide in this particular episode or in this particular phase of the presentation. A decline in inequality of consumption in India in the decade before the economic reforms of 1991. Let's note that inequality did decline in the decade before 1991, can be attributed to regulatory distortions and state interference that suppressed incentive for individual effort and innovation, leading to low levels of inequality, but with high poverty incidence in general. Growing up in Tamil Nadu, I remember a Tamil political magazine called Thuklak, which was published by the noted lawyer, journalist, actor Cho Ramaswamy. It was called Thuklak. It was a fortnightly magazine. And once I remember seeing a set of cartoons in the middle pages, which showed that at the top left corner of the center page pullout, there is a gentleman that appears on the cartoon with a fully suited tie, coat, jacket, etc. And then another person who is poor, who's only clad below the waist, but nothing above that. And then through a sequence of policies that he describes in that cartoon, by the time you come to the bottom right, the jacket, the trouser, and the tie and the shirt of the rich person is removed. Now both of them have only a piece of robe below the waist, and we have achieved socialism and equality in that sense. So is that the right way, therefore, to look at equality? Is that the equality that we want? So the point is, if rising tide lifts all boats, and if some boats, because they are better equipped, are able to ride the surf better than other boats, but the point remains that rising tide lifts all boats. From a country's perspective, from public policy perspective, what matters is the question to be asked. It is a popular idea that redistribution is a solution to rising living standards at scale, alleviating poverty and inequality in one stroke. First, the infeasibility of taxing wealth is widely discussed in academic literature. For example, I can give you several papers and you can take a look at it, but more importantly, this is where I feel that the counterfactual is missed. I'll give you a couple of simple examples to understand that life is full of asymmetry. We all know that money doesn't bring happiness, but we also know that lack of money brings unhappiness. Or closer to economics, we know that central banks can raise interest rates sky high to bring down inflation, even at the cost of recession. But central bankers learned that dropping interest rates doesn't ignite inflation as much as they try. I can give you multiple examples. That's because world is full of hygiene factors and not positive factors. Asymmetry is a fact of life. So, for example, you may not be able to generate more taxes or more growth, sometimes by lowering tax rates, but by raising the taxes, you may cause the wealthy to flee, in which case you will end up being worse off. So if you think that lower tax rates did not lead to greater investment, therefore the answer is not higher tax rates, because whatever little is invested will also flee. Capital is mobile. So we need to be aware of the counterfactual and the law of unintended consequences when we make proposals. If spreadsheets were all that it takes to ensure greater tax revenues and higher spending on health and education, we could have done that long time ago. And if you look at the Indian income tax data for assessment year 2024, which is the previous year 22-23, the data was put out. The top 7% of the returns in terms of all taxpayers had a total income of 61.8% of the returned income, but they paid 72.77% of all taxes paid. That is those with the income of 15 lakhs and above. In terms of individual taxpayers, the top 6.8% of the returns had 37% of the total returned income, in terms of tax returns. But that is income above 15 lakhs and above, but they paid 42.7% of the taxes paid. In other words, we are not taxing the so-called upper middle income and the upper income people less. Their share of taxes is actually more than their share of their income. And as much as 60% of the top income rich are not from the wealthiest Indian families. Many are first generation entrepreneurs, cricketers, and other celebrities. As of April 2024, a point that I mentioned earlier, there were 8.7 unique crore mutual fund systematic investment plan accounts. And even if you assume 2 SIPs per family, it shows 14% of Indian, which is about 300 million families, invest in equity. This shows that there is mobility. That is an important factor. And if I talk about the title of the slide will give away the source of the slide. It is from Nicholas Nassim Taleb's Skin in the Game. Static inequality is a snapshot view of inequality. I'll just give you a simple example. If there are two people, one person has 100 rupees, other person has 0. And if the total income in the country is 100, then there is extreme inequality. So persons A and B. A has 100, B has 0. But 1 year later, if B has 100 and A has 0, inequality still remains the same. But there has been a churn. There has been a mobility. So that's what matters. So the static measures of inequality do not look for whether there has been mobility in terms of those who are wealthy should be able to move down the ranks, and those who are not wealthy should be able to move up the ranks. So it is the churn, it is the dynamism, it is the mobility that matters other than the absolute levels of inequality. Clearly, when we say that inequality changes from year 1 to year 2, you need to show that those who are at the top are the very same people. In fact, for the ordinary poor people, their envy does not originate from the impoverished, concerned with the betterment of their condition, but with the clerical class. As with all communist movements, it's often the bourgeois or the clerical classes who are the early adopters of revolutionary theories. The poor are more busy engaged in uplifting themselves. If intellectuals are overly worried about inequality, it is because they tend to view themselves in hierarchical terms and thus think that others do so as well. I talked about the importance of churn and mobility, and this shows that the profit concentration in India seems to be reducing by most measures. If you look at the profit after tax of top 20 to the imputed profit after tax 3-year average, it's coming down. Profit after tax of the top 20 compared to the BSE 500 profit after tax. Profit after tax of the top 20 compared to the overall India incorporated profit after tax 3-year averages. If anything, the concentration levels are coming down rather than going up. And you can see that the PAT concentration of the top 20 seems to be reducing vis-a-vis the BSE 500, and the market cap as a percentage of BSE 500 for the top 20 companies is also not rising. So there is mobility. There is people who are creating new products and new services are making it to the top, and not the same set of people who have been in the top in the beginning do not continue to stay there. And excepting the big ride in COVID, the profit concentration of top 20 is reverting to its long-term trend after an unusual period. Naval Ravikant, who is very well known in the tech area in the United States, and this quote is good to note. Free people make free choices. Free choices mean you get unequal outcomes. You can have freedom or you can have equal outcomes. You can't have both. It was similar to what Benjamin Franklin said: if we sacrifice liberty for a little safety, we end up deserving neither liberty nor safety. So, in other words, what is important from a public policy perspective is to remember that public policy effects are asymmetric in nature. Taxing capital less may not make them invest, may not make capitalists invest, but taxing capital more will drive capital away. It is easy to drive capital out, but it is a lot harder to bring it back in. That is one more asymmetry. Equality of access and opportunities matter more for public policy than equality of outcomes, relatively speaking. Individual attitudes, skills, and effort also matter for outcomes. From the state perspective, it's important to continue to strive towards access and opportunity for everybody, regardless of starting points or endowments. Enforcing equality through regulation hurts micro and small businesses more, given their limited management and financial bandwidth, rather than hurting the big guys. They can find their way out. And more importantly, regulations condemn small and micro businesses to remain small. That is what happens with the tyranny of thresholds. When we tell them we are going to make concessions available to those below a particular threshold in terms of value or asset size or sales numbers, what happens is they end up getting incentivized to stay below those thresholds rather than growing, which is what keeps the gap between the large guys and the small guys as wide as ever. This is exactly what I meant by saying the law of unintended consequences operates when we try to address every problem through public policy, well-meaning interventions, but they could be delivering counterproductive results. Policy experts, therefore, must beware of asymmetric effects of public policy and the law of unintended consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Nageswaran. I'm sure all of you are enjoying this intellectual dialogue that is evolving now in this evening. We would open up the floor for questions. So I'm sure the front chairs, while I see a lot of smile, I'm sure students have a lot of questions to come up with. They must be getting quite confused as to what is happening and what should be seen. But let me first invite for further clarification Professor Dholakia, who has been an eminent commentator on various economic issues, particularly related to the way monetary and fiscal policy should be viewed. So without further ado, Professor Dholakia.
Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi. Professor Thomas Piketty, my fellow panelists and friends in the audience. Well, this has been a very, very important and very thought-provoking, I would say. The research, some kind of bold initiatives taken to come out with or fill up the data gaps that exist in the third world countries and come out with some kind of a long time series of something that never existed. To be very frank with you, when I was doing my research and my initiation in the field of economics, I was always looking at this kind of inequalities of income and wealth and tried to see if there is anything available. And probably nothing was available at that point in time. In fact, we were told time and often that several kind of the public policy impacts, and particularly the burden of taxation, etc., can be viewed more effectively if there was any kind of the data and estimates were available for the income distributions, not only at a point in time, but over a period of time. Now, apart from many other things that Thomas Piketty and his colleagues have been doing, what is most interesting is that they have generated some kind of a series of income distributions over a period of time, long period of time. And I'm amused to see that some of the estimates are on an annual basis. They must have done, and I saw their methodology and other things. They have very boldly attempted this exercise by making certain assumptions. I think interpolation, extrapolation is a normal routine thing that most of us are doing. They are also doing. The kind of things that is happening are very interesting to see from the perspective of an economics student, trying to see what are the impacts, ultimate impacts of any policy intervention or any policy package, because it is not only one policy that you can identify and do, but a policy package can be considered and see what is exactly its burden on the society in terms of the changes in income distribution over a period of time, or changes in the wealth distribution over a period of time. And that would be a very wonderful kind of the insights. I think Professor Piketty has and his colleagues have not done this, but I wish they should do it. When you try to do it, you still face some issues and some problems. And that is the reason why, I thought that I'll briefly put across some of my concerns about this, particularly with respect to India. I mean, I'm not referring to the developed countries, but the Indian experience. See, in the Monetary Policy Committee, we are sitting there to ensure that the inflation rate is kept under control. Whenever the inflation is rising, we think that inflation will hit the poor much more than the rich. And therefore, the income distribution will go against the poor. And therefore, to protect the poor largely, we would raise the interest rates in order to control inflation. Now, if you go by this research and the basic premise of the research, it is based largely on the relationship between the rate of return on capital, R, and G, the growth of the GDP or growth of income. And what you go by, if you really find that if the R increases, then it might actually lead to a worsening of the income distribution, and it will lead to a further inequality. That means what we are doing in Monetary Policy Committee and what we are doing in MPC is exactly counterproductive in a way. Because what we are doing is we are trying to protect the poor and thereby increase the interest rates. And by increasing the interest rates, we are actually hitting the poor. If this works, it works out, it is fantastic. But I have some kind of apprehensions about this. The way the things are measured, because the way the things are measured also has an impact on the outcome. And sometimes it is even acknowledged by Professor Piketty in some of his writings that while this may not be the level may not be comparable, but the trends are, now the levels are equally relevant. But anyway, let me come to very briefly the main issues that I thought needs to be talked about and debated. Next slide, sorry. What is this one? So what I said is there are three issues which I consider in this case. Particularly in this presentation, I will only talk about these three. Rate of return on capital, R, is greater than the rate of growth. That leads to higher share of capital. That leads to higher personal income inequality. This is the fundamental kind of the element in the entire argument. The second is the conditions under which this will or will not apply. And the third one is some empirics, very high degree of personal income inequality estimates for India in recent times. If that is the kind of thing, then we need to really consider that in my paper in EPW, July 13, 2024, we had some kind of the estimates about R. It was in relation to the ideal rate of social rate of discount that one is talking about in the public sector and projects. But we ended up doing this exercise, and from there I am just quoting. In the year 2023-24, the very latest year, the weighted average lending rate for private sector was found to be 4.04%. This is in real terms. This is basically the opportunity cost of capital. The social time preference rate, calculating exactly the same kind of things that Professor Piketty has also been considering, Ramsey's model and other things, where you are talking about the pure rate of time preference, and then you talk about the elasticity of marginal utility, and then talk about the consumption growth per capita, etc. That works out to 4.5% in real terms for India. Because, it's important, because the elasticity of marginal utility turns out to be less than 1 for India. By and large, people think that it will be more than 1. But in India, it turns out to be less than 1. And this is very rigorously we have tried all alternatives, and finally we accepted this estimate. That is the reason why it turns out to be 4.5. Now, very quick check, smell check, as we call it, gives me more confidence, because if the opportunity cost of capital turns out to be 4.4% and the social time preference rate turns out to be 4.5%, they are very similar, very similar. The difference is statistical in a way. That means I can safely say that the rate R, the rate of return on capital, would be around 4.3%, around, maybe 4% to 4.5%. You can make it that way. On the other hand, the growth rate in India for the year 2023-24 turns out to be 8.1% in real terms. And if I take the long-term to medium-term average, it would be around 7.5%. Again, I'm on a conservative side. If I see these things, you do not have R less than, you do not have R greater than G, but you have R less than G. If that happens, and if the argument is correct about the relationship between R, G, and inequality, then what Shamika found in her presentation is absolutely justified and is absolutely expected. There is nothing contradictory about it. Therefore, let us look at the conditions under which this will happen in a very simplistic way. This is not a very technical way. If all profits are saved, this is the basic assumption. And these are neoclassical assumptions. If all profits are saved and all wages are consumed, and if ICOR, incremental capital output ratio, is exactly equal to the average capital output ratio, then G will be exactly equal to R, as shown. If some wages are saved, rather than all wages consumed. If some wages are saved, then I is greater than the rate of return times capital, and therefore G is greater than R. This is absolutely possible. This is possible. This has exactly happened, and this is what you find. If K upon Y, the average capital output ratio, is greater than the I core, that means that our average capital output ratio has a tendency to fall over time, which is happening in India. Incidentally, whenever the growth rate is accelerating, you do find this kind of a thing happening. Then again, G will be greater than R. So I am not in a position to see that the basic premise and basic assumptions about the paper, that R greater than G, is not actually obtaining in India. It is the other way around. G is consistently more than R for a longer period of time, particularly after 1980. Definitely this is happening. Finally, I would rather like to come to the point that we have a personal income distribution, and this is again this is based on a presentation that I made to the Central Board of Reserve Bank of India way back, and now I have ended up revising that some of the estimates based on the comments from the Revenue Secretary and the present government, the governor of the Reserve Bank. I ended up revising a few things, and finally these are the estimates that I am getting. This is a very rough and ready, broad, but very, very solid estimates about the income inequality in India. This uses the tax tables that Professor Piketty and his associates are also using. But it also uses certain other sources which are available very readily. I mean, say for instance, I would say that the personal income distribution, if I consider, then those who are not required to file ITRs is an important category in India. Very important category. Sir, what is happening is that when you use the income tax data, by and large, you forget about the fact that in India, tax evasion is a rule rather than exception. I mean, number of tax evaders have, of course, declined over the last few years. Last, particularly 4 to 5 years, they have sharply declined. But let us understand, the tax evaded income as a proportion is significantly high even today. Very significantly high. Now, all that I have done is I have taken the personal income rather than the NNP, which I think Professor Piketty and others are also doing, but not exactly the same. It is the personal income which requires many other adjustments than what you people are doing. Then what you are finding is that there is a definite segment which is not required to file the returns, which is a below poverty line. And that income, that data on about their income and their proportion and their population is available. Actually, I can do the same exercise over a period of time to show and see that the results are absolutely consistent with what Shamika has talked about. So below poverty line population, you see this is the bottom of our pyramid. It's the bottom. They are 8.07, I mean 8.07 crores, which is 14.96, almost 15% of the total earners in the country. Income tax is leviable only to the earners. Please understand. So I am taking only about the earners. I cannot confuse between the population and the income tax payer because it is an individual. I cannot do that. I have to do the apple to apple comparison. If that is the case, 15% of the earners are below poverty line. 35.38% of the earners are owning agricultural land, and therefore whatever they earn, they can manipulate and make sure that they don't pay, they don't have to bother about the income tax. So 36, almost 36% belong to that category. Their income, in the total income share, it is about 30%, 29.5%. The below poverty line, it is only 4.47%. Then there is a third category, which is having the income above below poverty line, above the poverty line, but they are below the tax exempt limit of 2,50,000 per person, per earner. If I consider that, then their proportion in the total earners is about 30.43%. And their income share is about 25.62%. Then that brings me to the next thing, which is IT filers, return filers. Their average income turns out to be 7.08 lakhs, which is significantly more than double the average income. Okay. Now, if I consider that particular thing, they are about 11.80%, 81% of the total earners are belonging to that category. And their income is about 28.17%. Sir, that leaves me with the last category, the so-called tax evaders, which Professor Piketty and his associates are very sweetly ignoring and maybe confusing with the rest of the things. I'm not too sure what is happening to that. They are, according to my most conservative methodology to estimate, this is not easily available. If this is not black and white, please understand. This is largely gray, and therefore one has to estimate. So most conservative estimate gives me 7.42% of the earners are actually evading the tax. They are not filing the tax returns at all, whereas they should. And their average income is about 10 lakhs. Okay. When I consider all these things, their income share is about 25%. So when I consider all these things, sir, the top, let me see the way in which the inequality statistics are given. The bottom 50.3% of the earners are earning only 21.2% of the income. Bottom 50% earning 21%. The top 19.2% are earning 52.2%. Sir, it is nowhere close to what is being talked about. Therefore, I am of the opinion that while these efforts to estimate are really laudable, but they require definite kind of the improvement in a serious way. If you want to make use of these statistics, not just for demonstrating and showing something that we have done, but to be useful in the policy making, you need to improve the quality of these estimates. These are right now almost like assumptions. They are not estimates only. They are estimates based on large number of assumptions, and these assumptions are questionable. One has to very, very carefully look at and improve this entire process. This is a very laudable exercise. It's an excellent kind of a framework, but we need to talk more about it. We need to do more research on this. Thank you very much.